Good morning.
Great. Thank you so much for being here with us this morning.
It's a pleasure.
Do you hear me okay?
I hear you fine.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have a group of people here that are really excited to share some thoughts and hear your thoughts early on the issue of Palestine. And this is a series that we started called the Sunday School Cafe, where we bring people together on Sunday morning to talk about important foreign policy issues. We decided to start the first one with you on Palestine, and part of the homework that we try to give people is reading your book, The 100 Years War on Palestine. Thank you so much for joining us.
Not at all. I see that there are some people actually in the cafe.
Yes, there are people sitting here. Do you see us?
Yeah, I can see. I see you standing there with a mic.
Right. So we want to get right to it. This is sort of a lecture format, which is something you're used to. You were a professor at Columbia University, and for many years, I know my daughter took a class with you and loved it.
What grade did she get?
I'm sorry?
What grade did she get?
I don't remember. I don't remember how well she did.
I'm sure she did well.
Well, because if she didn't do well, she wouldn't love you so much. So it's a direct relationship to the grade. Anyway, I want to get down to the book and just kind of throw out a few sort of big topics, and then have you then speak to us for as long as you like, and then we'll see if there's a little bit of time for a couple of questions at the end. So I know the book is divided into the idea of wars, and you outline six wars, and you also say that in each one of these times that it happened, that the Palestinians did not exist, that it was something that was imposed on them as opposed to with them. We may have lost you for a second. Are you there?
Yeah, I can hear you. I don't know what's happened. I just got notification that we've lost contact with my camera. I do not know why that would be. But anyway, fiddle with it. It seems to be connected. If you can hear me, let's just go ahead. I don't know what just happened.
We can hear you. We can hear you fine. So I know that you speak about, the beginning of this is the 1917 Balfour Declaration, and it continues all the way to, you wrote the book in 2020. Now, I wanted to ask you, I know since then, what would be the next chapter? Obviously, October 7th made a huge pivot in what's the relationship with Palestine and how people perceive it all over the world. Can you speak a little bit about that, and then go back to the history that you write about in the book?
Yeah, I hesitate to say anything about what another chapter would look like. I've written an afterword to the English edition of the book, which I published. I guess it was finished in April of last year. And even since April, a great deal has changed, and everything seems to be changing from day to day. One of the things that I said about October 7th is that it's not really a unique event in history. There was an attempt to say that it was, and I don't really think it is. I think it's pretty much a continuation of many of the things that I argue have been happening for the past 100 years in Palestine, which is to say complicity between the greatest power on earth, whether it was Britain in the past or the United States in the present, an Israeli drive to ethnically cleanse Palestine, attacks on civilians as a means of harming militant groups. These are patterns that have been well established over decades and generations. They're not unique to the post October 7th situation. On the other hand, what has happened since October 7th is enormously important. This is by far the largest number of Palestinians who have never been killed by Israel. The death toll is astronomical compared to every earlier instance of this war. I mean, there were thousands killed in 1936-39. There were thousands, maybe 15,000 killed Palestinians, or 20,000 in 1948. There were about 20,000 killed in the 1982 war. The number of killed in Gaza is at least triple, maybe quadruple that. So it's by far the most extensive loss of life in this entire history of this long, long war. And actually, the same is true on a much smaller scale on the Israeli side. There haven't been as many Israeli civilian casualties since the 1948 war. So the scale of it is certainly quite horrific in terms of especially the number of civilians killed and the degree of destruction. What Israel did in 1948 was to empty villages. They didn't destroy them all. What they've done in Gaza is to destroy 60 to 80%, completely destroy, make uninhabitable, maybe 60 to 80%, probably closer to 80 of the structures in Gaza. That kind of devastation has never happened in Palestine. So I could go on and on about the ways in which it's different, but I stressed in the afterword that I wrote, last year for the new edition of the book in England, I stressed that there are actually more continuities than differences. I mean, the degree of support of the Biden administration for Israel was unprecedented in its extent. No American president has encouraged and allowed and armed and supported Israel in its war on the Palestinians for this long a period. But every American president has supported Israel from 1948 onwards. So in principle, it's not new. In extent, I think the Biden administration will go down in history as the most anti-Palestinian administration ever, including Truman, including Reagan, including even Trump in his last iteration in office. We'll see what happens with him this term. So that's how I would characterize what's happened since October 7th. It's changed a lot. It's changed a lot in the region as well. And I wouldn't even begin to speculate on how those changes are going to work out, whether in Lebanon, whether in Syria, whether in Iran, whether in the neighboring Arab countries that have been very much affected by this in different ways. I think that there are going to be tremors. Every Arab-Israeli war, every war on Palestine has caused tremors in the neighboring countries that sometimes took several years to develop into change. It took less than a year in Syria for the government to be overthrown by officers who'd fought in Palestine in 1948. It took 4 years in Egypt for the government to be overthrown by officers who'd fought in Palestine. It took 10 years in Iraq. So these changes, if they are changes that result from it, may be long term, and I can't predict what might happen. But I think a lot has changed because of this war in the Middle East as a whole. So that's how I would. Those are some of the preliminary things I would say about this horrible 15-year genocide, the 15-month, I should say, genocide that we've been watching. Would you like me to now talk a little bit about the book, the structure of the book?
Yes, that would be great. I think this is more of a lecture format as opposed to a conversation, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So please, thank you.
Sure. I think a lot is summed up in the title and subtitle of the book. I titled it "The 100 Years War on Palestine" because this is not just a war between two countries like Germany and France, or Napoleon and England. This is a war on Palestine being waged not just by the Zionist project in Israel, but by great powers. The major decisions have been taken by great powers, and they're mainly they're then enshrined in international resolutions. So the British decide to support Zionism, and they then enshrine the commitment of the Balfour Declaration in a League of Nations mandate. And this is, I argue, this is a declaration of war on Palestine. So this is the beginning of what I call the war on Palestine. You could argue, well, it begins with Palestinian and Arab nationalism, or it begins with the rise of Zionism. And yeah, those are plausible starting points. But the war, as we know it today, and as it has gone on since 1917, is declared by the British, and then is again and again and again declared in coordination with the great powers. The partition resolution is an international resolution to give most of an Arab country to a Jewish minority. And that's the Americans and the Soviets decide to do that. And that is the basis for the war that Israel then wages, the Zionist movement and then Israel, after it's established on May 15th, 1948, wage against the Palestinian people to dispossess them and to take over most of their country. I argue that the same thing is true at different phases. Those are the 6 chapters, each of which I call a declaration of war. So that's the core of the title. I'm trying the 100 Years War on Palestine. I'm trying to disabuse people of this, in my view, simplistic notion that this is simply a struggle between two peoples. I mean, there are two peoples now, but that's not what's driving it. You do not have this war without 2,000-pound bombs delivered by the United States. You do not have this war without the United States preventing a ceasefire by vetoing Security Council resolutions 3 times in 15 months. You cannot have this war without that massive external support, without a green light from Washington, and without diplomatic interference being run by the Americans, as they did in 67, as they did in 73, and so on, as they did in 48, and as the British did during the British Mandate. So I try through that title to make a point. This is a war on Palestine, and this is a war in which the great powers are involved. They're active. They are parties to this war. The subtitle, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, again, is meant to frame the argument that I'm making. This is not just poor refugees arriving from Europe after being persecuted over many centuries and millennia by European Christianity just because they were Jews, and then being savagely attacked by a bunch of fanatical Arabs. No. Zionism is a national project which arranges a transactional relationship with Britain to support it and to help it implant itself and to help it take over Palestine. There's nothing peaceful. There's nothing innocent about the intentions of the Zionist project. It is a settler colonial project. It's a national project as well. It's also meant as a refuge from persecution. There's also a historic connection between Judaism and the Holy Land. But in the way it operates, in what it does in Palestine, it's a settler colonial project. And in that respect, it's similar in many ways to other settler colonial projects, whether in North America or whether in Ireland or whether in Algeria or South Africa or other parts of the world. It's different. It has its own unique characteristics, but it is a settler colonial project. And it has that aggressive, forward-moving, force-based approach to the indigenous population. They must be gotten out of the way. I quote a very important early Zionist leader by the name of Zev Jabotinsky as saying, that what we're trying to do is to transform Palestine into the land of Israel. That's what Zionism is about. It's about turning an Arab country into a Jewish country. And that necessitates and involves massive, unceasing violence against the indigenous population until they're either driven out or killed or subjugated and forced to accept whatever their new masters dictate to them. That's what settler colonialism does, incessantly and permanently. And it's always got to be doing this, or it collapses. And then finally, the last part of the subtitle, History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, frames what Palestinians have always done, not as blind terrorism, but rather as resistance to this settler colonial process. Every colonized people has resisted throughout history. Every colonized people will resist throughout history. And as long as the Zionist project and the state of Israel are oppressing the Palestinians in this way, one way or another, you're going to have resistance. There are different forms of resistance: violent, nonviolent, boycotts, diplomacy, propaganda, whatever. And you can code them if you want as terrorism, where they involve attacks on civilians. But if you're going to use that term, you have to use it for state violence as well, which in the case of Israel is mainly directed against civilians. I mean, they've killed 4 or 3 or 5 civilians for every armed militant that they've managed to kill throughout their history. This is not just now. the British did the same thing in suppressing the 36-39 revolt. They attacked villages. When they could catch the guerrillas, they would kill them. But most of the time, they would just attack the villages where they said these people were based, killing civilians, shooting people, and doing the things that they later taught the Israelis. The British later taught the Israelis to do. So that's the framing of the book, in terms, in other words, of a war on Palestine, in terms of the central involvement of external powers, in terms of this being a settler colonial process, and in terms of what the Palestinians have done in response as essentially resistance to that process. I should say a little bit about how I wrote the book and why it's different from pretty much everything else I've ever written. I've written several other books, many of them very academic and very narrowly focused on, experts and other historians. Some of them were more directed to a general public, but I never brought myself into the narrative in any of the work I did previously. Even the books like the book The Iron Cage or Resurrecting Empire, which is a book about American policy in the Middle East. I didn't insert myself into the narrative, and I used family and other records, but I essentially was writing them as a historian for mainly other historians, and as much as possible for a general audience. And as I prepared to write this book and began to think about it, I was urged, especially by my son Ismail and by one of my cousins Nawaf, to do this in a different way, to not write it as an academic monograph, to not write a book mainly intended for other specialists, but to write a book, first of all, that was essentially directed at a general audience, to ordinary readers who are not knowledgeable about Palestine. And secondly, to write it in the first person and to talk about the kind of things that I would tell my kids from my personal experiences or from the experiences of members of my family. So a lot of this book is based on things I myself experienced, or things that my parents or aunts and uncles told me, or cousins told me, personal private family papers of my family and other families. I mean, I use my wife's grandfather's memoir, for example. He was a newspaper editor in Palestine, an unpublished memoir. I use all kinds of other personal things to, how should I say, humanize the narrative, to show that this is not just dry history. This is what happened to my grandparents. This is what happened to my wife's grandfather. This is how this person who I happen to know was imprisoned by the Israelis in 1948. That kind of thing. I tried to, as much as possible, tell the story through individuals' narratives, whether the things that I myself saw or was told, or things that I read about that people set down about their own experiences. And I think that one of the reasons that the book has been much better received than anything I've ever written is because of that, I guess you'd call it, personal aspect to it. I mean, it's not an autobiography in any way, but I tried to bring in as much as I could of the things that I thought people could relate to in terms of individual experience. I guess the last thing I talk about would be the structure of the book. I talk about it in terms of 6 declarations of war on Palestine. The first, as Andy mentioned, being the Balfour Declaration and the League of Nations Mandate. The Balfour Declaration basically said there's one people in Palestine, there's the Jewish people, and there's one group with rights to a national home, and that's the Jewish people. And the rest are just the non-Jewish residents. Now, they were 95% of the population, never mentioned by name, never described as having political or national rights. They were to have only civil and religious rights. So Britain was saying, you don't exist. These people exist. These are the only people who have rights in this country. We'll protect your civil and religious rights, but you have no other rights here. And that was the basis of the British mandate for Palestine. And when the Palestinians rose up against that at repeated periods, the British suppressed them. And the most intense period of resistance was during a revolt from 1936 to 39, during which the British killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled something between 14 and 17% of the Palestinian adult male population. It's a lot of people. And that's pretty ferocious repression. And they weren't only killing guerrillas in the hills, they were slaughtering people right and left, bombing villages. The Royal Air Force was bombing villages. So Britain declared war in 1917, but it executed that war in repressing the 1920, 1921, 1929, and especially the 1936 to 39 revolts that the Palestinians launched against British rule. And so in that sense, I'm arguing this was not just the Zionist movement. This was Britain. The actual dirty work is done by the British. The Zionists just play along. They're in a transactional relationship with Britain. They've cut a deal with Britain. They'll provide a garrison for the Suez Canal. They will be a loyal, steadfast ally. I quote a British official as saying, what Britain is doing in Palestine is to create a little loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of hostile Arabism. So that's how they saw the settlers that they were facilitating coming to Palestine. They saw them the way they saw the Scottish and English settlers who Britain planted in Northern Ireland in the 16th and 17th centuries. That's how the British saw Zionism. And that's why I call it not a Zionist or an Israeli war. It's a war in which both they, the Zionists, and later the State of Israel, but also the United States and earlier the British were engaged in. In the case of the British, they actually fought the war, especially in the 30s. The second declaration of war is the partition plan of 1947, which is pushed through over overwhelming opposition of what was then a very small number of third world countries who had been admitted to the United Nations, essentially by the Americans and the Soviets. They strong-armed, they bribed, they threatened, and they managed to push a resolution which gave most of an Arab country to a Jewish minority. This was a violation of the Charter of the United Nations, which called for self-determination. And this was a power play by the Americans and the Soviets to achieve their own interests in Palestine at the expense of the Palestinian people. I describe it as a declaration of war. Now, the war was then fought by Israel with American and Soviet or Czech weapons. And they're backing financially and diplomatically. So the dirty work here is done by the Zionist militias and later what becomes the Israeli army. But the impulsion and the power behind it is not just the Zionist movement and not just the people who are actually fighting in the Israeli army. The impulsion and the power behind it is the Americans and the Soviets. I could go through the other wars. I could go through the Declaration of War of 1967. And I describe that both as America supporting Israel going to war in 1967 and the United States pushing through a resolution in the Security Council in November of 1967, Security Council Resolution 242. I could explain how I see that as a declaration of war, if people are interested. The next one would be the 1982 war. And as in 67, before the Israelis go to war, they go to Washington to ask for permission. In 1967, they had sent the head of the Mossad, who met with President Johnson, Secretary of Defense McNamara, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and they gave a green light for Israel. Same thing happens in 82. Ariel Sharon, who is the Israeli defense minister, goes to Washington. He meets with Secretary of State Haig. Alexander Haig gives him a green light. He lays out, we're going to do this to the Syrians. We're going to do this to the Palestinians. We're going to do this in Lebanon. And Haig gives him a green light. So this is not just an Israeli war. This is an Israeli-American war. The weapons are American. The Security Council vetoes are American. The permission is American. Cover is American. The actual fighting, of course, is done in 82 by Israel. I described the so-called peace process that leads to the Oslo Accords as a fifth declaration of war on Palestine. This is, in my view, an imposed settlement, an American and Israeli imposed settlement on the Palestinians, which the Palestinian leadership very unwisely accepted. I criticized their accepting the Oslo Accords in that chapter. And the last chapter is the wars on Gaza. So if I were to read, and which at the time I published the book in 2020. There had only been 3 or 4 of these Israeli campaigns against Gaza. The one of 1921 isn't of 2021. I keep saying 1921. 2021 is not covered in that chapter, nor, of course, is the war on Gaza that may have just ended with the ceasefire on January 19th. So that's a summary of the book. I end by saying I don't lay out what I think is the future. I'm a historian. I don't predict the future. I just say that there's not going to be a resolution of this unless it's based on equity and justice. And that means restoration of rights, and that means decolonization and dismantling structures of oppression that are meant to hold the Palestinians down and give privileges to Israelis. The only way that this can be settled is by changing those structures. How that happens, in what context, I couldn't even say. And I don't think we're necessarily closer to that today than we were when I finished writing this book in 2020. So that's a summary of the book.
Thank you very much. I want to go back and kind of fill in some of the blanks that are in here. Let's begin with the first one, the Balfour Declaration. What prompted the British to have the Balfour Declaration and have it be so that the Jews can have a homeland? What prompted that?
Different historians have ascribed different motivations to the British. I actually have been working on this since I was a graduate student, and it's the core of the first book I ever published about British policy in Palestine and Syria before World War I. And I am absolutely convinced, and I know I'm right about this, that the main reason that the British wanted to control Palestine had to do with strategic considerations. The British were worried from about 1904, 1905, that the eastern frontiers of Egypt were vulnerable to attack by the Ottomans, by their German allies. And in fact, they were right. An Ottoman army crosses the Sinai Peninsula, closes the Suez Canal in 1915. The British were also concerned by the possibility of roads or railways being built across from the Mediterranean to the Gulf, and that they would not control them. And the Mediterranean terminus of such a land route was Palestine. So the British had multiple strategic objectives in wanting to control Palestine. Well before 1917, well before Weizmann knew anybody in the British cabinet, well before the Zionist movement had entered into a transactional relationship with the British. In other words, British strategic objectives determined that Britain had to control Palestine. How to do that developed during World War II. Britain ended up conquering Palestine, and Britain ended up doing a deal with the Zionist movement. You will establish yourselves here, and you will form a garrison for us. In the words of this British official that I quoted, Britain created a loyal little Jewish Ulster in a hostile Arab sea. And that was what the Zionist project was intended by Britain to do. It had strategic objectives. Now, there were other objectives. Christian Zionism. From the early 19th century, many British Protestants had come to believe that the return of the Jews was a Christian duty. The return of the Jews to their supposed ancestral homeland was a bounden duty of Christians. And from the 1830s, you have important British figures arguing this and arguing that Britain should get more involved in Palestine. So I think that's an important subsidiary motivation. Certainly for people like Lloyd George, who was the British Prime Minister and who was a religious person, and for some other members of the British cabinet, that's a subsidiary reason. But the main reason is strategic.
You talked about 1967 as being kind of a pivot point. You mentioned here that 1967 marked an extraordinary resurgence of Palestinian national consciousness and resistance to Israel's negation of Palestinian identity. And you say that the central paradox of the 1967 war is that by defeating the Arabs, Israel resurrected the Palestinians. Can you please elaborate on that?
Yeah. One of the things that happens after 1948, after the Nakba of 1948, in which the majority of Palestinians are driven out of their homeland and off their land, is that Palestine appears to disappear, not just from the map, but from the politics of the Arab world. The Palestinians are dispersed, their leadership is discredited, loses the material basis of their status in Palestinian society. They lose their land, they lose their businesses. Most ordinary Palestinians are made destitute. And it takes a very long time for Palestinians to recreate and restructure and rebuild their national movement. And that's going on in the 60s and the 50s and the 60s. And it really only comes out with the defeat of the Arab armies in 1967. that in fact the Palestinians can't rely on the Arab states to liberate their homeland, to solve their problems. And my camera came back. I just saw the chat thing. And so the Palestinian national movement that had developed clandestinely in the 50s and the 60s in Gaza, in Jordan, in Beirut, in Cairo, in Kuwait, takes the forefront. And the Palestinian resistance movement becomes the face, later the PLO, become the face of Palestinian nationalism. And for the first time, the Palestinians actually become actors on their own behalf, the first time since 1948. And the 67 war makes that possible. The defeat of Egypt and Syria and Jordan, the end of these hopes that these countries would actually do something on behalf of Palestine, leads Palestinians to become more self-reliant and to become more assertive in the Arab world, and to reach over the heads of Arab regimes to Arab public opinion, which has always been very supportive of the Palestinians. I've done research going back to the pre-World War I period. There has always been enormous interest in Palestine and support for the Palestinians throughout the Arabic-speaking world, from North Africa through the Gulf. And that has been the case in the 20s and the 30s. You had volunteers coming to fight in Palestine in 1936-39. You had volunteers coming from Egypt and Syria and Lebanon and Jordan to fight in Palestine in 1947-48. You have had Arab public support for the Palestinians. Now, the Arab governments have not, most of the time, been as supportive for a variety of reasons. But Arab public opinion has always been. And one of the things that the Palestinians do in the 60s and 70s is to reach over the heads of much more wary Arab governments to Arab public opinion. And they're very successful for a while in doing
that. I want you to talk a little bit about the Apollo Accords and what happened then. I know you were part of the negotiating team then. Can you please elaborate more about what happened during that time and why, as you refer to it, that's probably one of the worst decisions ever made by the Palestinian Authority to where we are today. It's sort of brought us where we are today. Can you just a little bit more on that?
Yeah, I wasn't involved in the Oslo negotiations. I was part of a Palestinian delegation which was involved in the Madrid and Washington negotiations from 1991 to 93. And then behind our backs, the PLO decided to start negotiating directly with Israel in Oslo and in other places, sometime in I think 1993. And what we learned in Washington was that the ceiling that the Americans and the Israelis were willing to allow the Palestinians was essentially a form of autonomy under continued Israeli colonization and occupation. Essentially, they took what Begin had put forward at Camp David to President Carter and President Sadat in 1978, and they dressed it up. And essentially, all we were allowed to negotiate for in Washington in the 10 rounds of negotiations that we undertook with the Israeli delegation was a glorified form of Palestinian autonomy under rigid Israeli control. And the delegation, which was mainly made up of people from the occupied territories, with a few people like me who were advisors, and a few people from the PLO who were there, the delegation said, this is completely unsatisfactory. I mean, this is what we have now. This is not going to lead to independence, self-determination, statehood, sovereignty. This is meant to keep us under the Israeli boot heel forever. And the Americans kept saying, well, you'll have final status negotiations after X number of years, and you can discuss issues like Jerusalem, sovereignty, refugees, borders, water, and so on. We said, those are the things we want to negotiate now. At Madrid, all the other Arab countries began to negotiate peace with Israel. The Syrians began to negotiate a peace treaty. The Lebanese began to negotiate a peace treaty. The Jordanians began to negotiate a peace treaty, which they eventually signed with Israel. And the Syrians were very close, actually. The Palestinians were not allowed to do that. There was no option for a final resolution of this conflict at Madrid and afterwards, all we were allowed to talk about was autonomy by the Americans and the Israelis. Those were the ground rules laid down by Secretary Baker. And we kept telling the PLO leadership in Tunis, you can't accept this. You must not accept this. This is just the status quo dressed up. And Rabin decided, Prime Minister Rabin, after he was elected in 1992, that he was getting nowhere with this. The Palestinian delegation that was there in Washington wasn't accepting what basically Begin had put forward. And he decided to deal directly with the PLO. And that's what they eventually did. And the PLO, to our misfortune as Palestinians, ended up walking right into the trap that Rabin had laid for them. Because Rabin changed three aspects of Israeli policy. He recognized that the Palestinians were a people. He said, yes, you're a people. He recognized that the PLO represented that people. Okay, you're the sole representative. And he said, and I'll talk to the PLO. He never recognized that the Palestinians have a right to national self-determination, have a right to independence, have a right to a state, have a right to be sovereign. Israel has never accepted any of those things. When it talks about a two-state solution, it does not talk about absolute sovereignty, complete independence, a Palestinian state which controls its own borders, which controls its own population registry. In his last speech, Rabin made clear what he was offering the Palestinians. He said, what we are offering the Palestinians, he said this to the Knesset a couple of weeks before he was assassinated. What we are offering the Palestinians is less than a state. We will control the Jordan River Valley, which means we will control entry and exit, which means Israel continues to be the occupying power. The way they controlled Gaza from the outside, they would have controlled the so-called Palestinian state. It wouldn't have been a state. It would have been a glorified Bantustan. And that's all that any Israeli leader, whether Rabin or whether later Barak or later Olmert, has ever been willing to offer the Palestinians. They dressed it up in different ways. President Clinton dressed it up in different ways in the Camp David talks in 2000. The talks that Olmert had dressed it up in different ways. But that was always the bottom line. Israel would maintain security control. And that would mean you're not sovereign. That means you're not a state. And so, to my way of thinking, this was a disastrous mistake on the part of Arafat. You can ask me why I think he did it. There's a whole bunch of explanations for that. But it's one of the worst mistakes in Palestinian history.
Oftentimes, even the most progressive members of Congress only speak of a two-state solution as any possibility. Is that just another delay tactic, as you have mentioned in so much of the book? All the delay tactics that the Israelis have exercised. Is this just another delay tactic, or is this has any viability at all? Do you think the idea of a two-state solution, whatever that might be?
Yeah. Well, let me say two or three things. The first thing is, when people talk about two-state solution, they never address the elephant in the room, which is that there's 750,000 Israelis living in the West Bank. And they have been planted there in order to prevent the possibility of a contiguous, sovereign, independent Palestinian state. They're not just there haphazardly. They're there to control strategic points and to cut up Palestinian population centers from one another. That's why they're there. They are there to prevent the Palestinian state. How are you going to unwind that? How are you going to create a sovereign Palestinian state in a territory in which every strategic point is controlled by 750,000 illegal Israeli settlers? Secondly, how are you going to get the Israelis to move 750,000 of their citizens who vote? What Israeli government is going to be able to overcome that enormously powerful political bloc? And thirdly, when is the United States ever going to consider the Palestinians a vital national interest, that they're willing to go toe-to-toe with the Israel lobby in Washington and with Israeli governments, which have been absolutely committed since the beginning, since Israel was established, to prevent any Palestinian sovereignty anywhere in what they call the land of Israel? I mean, the United States, when its national interests are at stake, has forced Israel to do many, many things, but almost nothing relating to Palestine. When they want to sell weapons to Arab Gulf states, they do it over the Israeli objections. When they wanted to force Israel into negotiations in 1973, 74, 75, Kissinger forced them to accept withdrawal from part of the Golan Heights and from part of Sinai. Carter forced them, President Carter forced them to give up Sinai in the Camp David Accords because there were vital American strategic interests at stake. The United States was going to win the Cold War in the Middle East by bringing Egypt over, by giving the Egyptians what they wanted, and at the same time giving the Israelis peace with the most important, the only powerful Arab state. So it was a good deal for the Israelis, but the Israelis fought it. They fought it kicking and screaming. The first disengagement agreement with Egypt, the disengagement agreement with Syria, the second disengagement, the Camp David Accords. It was like pulling teeth, but the United States forced the Israelis against their will to do what ended up being in their best interest. So when an American vital interest is at stake, when Israel occupies Sinai in 1956, the Americans kicked them out. They boot them, they forced them to leave unceremoniously. They slap them in the face and tell them, you're a minor power, get the hell out of here. Eisenhower, when Ronald Reagan wanted them to stop the war on Lebanon, he picks up the phone. He says, this is a Holocaust. You got to stop. Half an hour later, the Israelis stop. So when a vital American interest, that's one of the few cases that the Americans did anything in favor of the Palestinians. Of course, they had their own objectives that were not in our favor at the time. My point is, on Palestine, the United States has yet to show that it sees opposing strong Israeli interests as being in the American national interest. Whereas where the Gulf is concerned, whereas winning the Cold War in the Middle East, whereas avoiding a war with the Soviet Union back in 73, those are vital interests. The JCPOA that Obama negotiated, Israelis fought it kicking and screaming. Netanyahu came to Washington and was invited by the Republicans twice to address joint sessions of Congress. He attacked the foreign policy of the president from the podium in the Senate and did everything he could to scuttle that deal. The United States just rammed it down their throats. Screw you. Who are you? This is our vital national interest. You want us to go to war with Iran for you? No, we're not going to do that. That's what Obama said. So a two-state solution, if the United States wanted it, if the United States was willing to overcome really quite, this for Israel is the be-all and the end-all. You know, transforming Palestine into the land of Israel is what it's all about. And anything that reverses that process is something they're going to fight tooth and nail in ways that they will not fight over occupation of Sinai or the JCPOA. And I have not seen an American president who's willing to put the weight of the United States behind this. So a two-state solution, there are so many obstacles to it. The main obstacle is the United States is not serious about it. It accepts whatever the Israelis claim is a two-state solution. And what the Israelis intend at the best of times is a super Bantustan under Israeli control. That's all that Rabin and Barak and Olmert were offering. And this Netanyahu and the governments since Olmert, they haven't even offered that. They don't want any Palestinian anything. I mean, they're trying to dismantle the Palestinian Authority today.
And speaking of that, what do you see the future of Palestinian leadership? I know that the PA has been given control of the Rafah crossing and other things, and where do you think that stands vis-a-vis PA, Hamas, and the leadership right now in Palestine?
I mean, the Palestinian national movement is in a very difficult situation right now. It's deeply divided. It has in the PA a weak group of people who are basically committed to doing Israel's bidding and the bidding of the United States and the bidding of European countries and the bidding of powerful Arab countries. They don't represent the Palestinians. They represent their own selfish national interests and the interests of the people who pay them and control them, mainly Israel and the United States. And that is a leadership that relies on its secret police and its security forces to help Israel to colonize the West Bank, help Israel to maintain its occupation. They don't represent a Palestinian interest at all, in my view. And they're an obstacle to progress, in my view. And then the rest of the Palestinian national movement is deeply divided over tactics, over strategy, over where to go. over what the Palestinian objective should be. And so there's a huge vacuum of leadership and of strategic thinking. There are a lot of young people who have fantastic ideas, and there's a wonderful element of civil society, which is mainly made up of younger people who are not all directly involved in politics. And I hope that from them will come a new leadership. But it's impossible to predict this. Right now, the situation is quite grim. The situation of division and paralysis, as far as strategic objectives are concerned, is very harmful to the Palestinians.
Again, thank you so much for your time. I want to just end with the maybe some comments about the way forward, and what do you suggest that people should be focused on at this point, whether it's putting pressure on Congress, whether it's going out in the streets, your experience about the way forward, and what do you see the future right now? And I know that you don't have a crystal ball necessarily, but what do you see as the future of this latest very horrific situation that the Palestinians are in right now?
I mean, in the short run, things look extremely grim, but I actually think that there's a lot of reason for optimism in some of the changes that have taken place over the last 5 or 10 years. And they've been accelerated by this horrible war of 15 months. Zionism in Israel always enjoyed widespread, wall-to-wall public support in every Western country. It wasn't just the elites. It wasn't just Lord Balfour. It was all the British political parties. It wasn't just Harry Truman. It was ordinary people supported the idea of a Jewish national home, supported the idea of a refuge from persecution, believed that the connection between Judaism and the Holy Land meant that the Israelis had a right to Palestine. And that was wall-to-wall support throughout the West for 100 years, really, from the inception of modern political Zionism in the late 19th century. That has changed. You now have severe, serious, well-grounded contestation on a mass basis in every Western country. The global South shifted long ago. They know that this is second colonial. They do not support what Israel does in almost any non-Western country. But what has changed is in the West, which is the bastion of support for Israel. Without the West, Israel doesn't exist. Without Balfour and Britain, without Truman and the United States, it doesn't exist. Without President Biden, they can't fight the war that they just fought. Every single warplane, every single helicopter is American. Almost all of the ordnance, the bombs, the shells are American. The diplomatics, it's American. You don't fight that war without the United States. Public opinion in the United States has shifted. Majorities in the United States opposed Biden's policy, opposed Israel's war, were in favor of a ceasefire a year ago, and were opposed to the United States sending weapons to Israel. That includes majorities of Democrats and large numbers of independents and Republicans. This is brand new. This has never happened in American history. It's never happened in the history of Western support for Israel. That not just the elites supported Israel. Everybody supported Israel. And that's no longer the case. They still retain support of American elites, the people who own our media, the people who own our politicians, the billionaires, the oligarchs who own our politicians, the people who own our universities, the same billionaires and millionaires who are the boards of trustees, the people who own our foundations, the people who own the American economy. They still support Israel in their overwhelming majority. Public opinion doesn't. That's really important. So, continuing to educate people, continuing to agitate, continuing to put pressure on our elected representatives to represent us instead of represent money and power, which is what they do now. It's an uphill slog, of course. They're spending all their time collecting money, and the people who have money are largely supportive of Israel. As is the military-industrial complex, as are the warmongers who form our foreign policy elite, the neoconservative, full-spectrum dominance war hawks who are in every administration. They shift from Biden to Trump and from Bush to Clinton. They're the same people. All those people support Israel, but public opinion doesn't. And for the first time, you've seen in Congress senators, by a dozen, 2 dozen senators, dozens of congressmen and women, who actually have come out, raised their head above the parapet, taken fire from AIPAC, and have said things that go counter to the lying, narrative that Israel has been putting forward for so many generations. This is new. This never happened before, and there's no guarantee that evolution will continue in the same direction. But I think that something has fundamentally changed. People know that a lot of what Israel is saying are complete and utter lies. And what our politicians repeat, the same Israeli narrative, is false. That what the media is saying is a lie, especially young people. None of them watch CNN. None of them read the New York Times. They know that these are lying mouthpieces for our government and for Israel's government, and for a whole series, a tissue of lies, human shields, all kinds of things. They brought it on themselves. I could go on and on and on and on. Self-defense. You don't destroy every university in Gaza out of a desire to defend yourself. You don't attack hospitals out of a desire. You don't do the things that destroy water, electricity, sewage. What does that have to do with self-defense? And our government shilled for those disgusting genocidal lies. And kids, young people understand that. And one of the reasons that Harris lost is because she lost huge numbers of people who had voted for Biden, young people especially, who couldn't hold their noses and vote for her, given the Biden administration's unceasing wall-to-wall support for this genocidal war. And one of the reasons Trump won over a lot of voters in Michigan, young people, but especially Arab Americans, is he said, "I'll stop the war." And by God, he imposed a ceasefire on Netanyahu, who under no circumstances would have allowed Biden to force him to stop. Under no circumstances. If Harris had been elected, the war would still be going on, in my opinion, at the same level it was going on back in December and in early January. So I think that there are all kinds of positive things that can be built on. There's some really challenging things coming down because the repression of Palestinian advocacy is going to be fiercer than anything we've ever seen before. We're seeing it on campus, and it's going to get much, much worse. This administration is going to crack down with a fist of iron on Palestine advocacy under the claim that it's support for terrorism, the false claim that it's support for terrorism. But I think that those changes are likely to continue in spite of that. I hope so, anyway.
We have about 5 minutes left, and we have, speaking of agitators, we have 2 of the best agitators around. We have Ann Wright, who's a colonel that resigned from the State Department. She's agitating every single day, every single minute. And of course, Medea Benjamin, Carter Kopik, who's always now in the halls of Congress and trying to shift the public opinion. I wanted to give Medea the last question before we let you go. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us this morning. And you touched on what I was going to ask, which is, you are from Columbia University, which has been traditionally the bastion of free speech. And the world really was so inspired by the activism at Columbia University and then horrified by the crackdown. How do you see students getting around the repression? Do you think Trump is going to follow through on actually expelling foreign students who participated in protests? And we talk so much about the BDS movement, but is there anything in that movement that you see particularly interesting that we could all put our efforts into to have it be more effective?
Well, Columbia is Columbia is going to be the template for what they do everywhere else. It helped to start the student movement, and I think that the way in which the Columbia administration cracked down was meant to show people the way that they're supposed to deal with student advocacy for Palestine. And I think that there's some grim days ahead. The situation at Columbia and at all the other campuses in New York, which was the epicenter of the student movement for a while, at NYU, at CUNY, at the New School, at other schools in the New York area, the situation is grim, and the student movement is under enormous pressure. I think that you mentioned expulsion of foreign students. That the government's going to do. That's not going to be the university. But expulsion of students from Columbia and other universities is ongoing. Suspension of students is ongoing. Disciplining of students is ongoing. There are disciplinary procedures almost every day. Today, I mean, we're talking in February of 2025, disciplinary procedures about actions that took place in the fall of 2023 are still underway. So the repression is, and the surveillance on camera on campus. They have hundreds of cameras everywhere. You have electronic swipe entry to the campus. You can't get on Columbia's campus unless you have the right kind of Columbia ID. That kind of repression is going to necessarily crimp the student movement for quite a while. But I think the thing that the movement showed, especially the first academic year, the fall of 2023 and the spring of 2024, was that it opened up the space for people to talk about Palestine. And I honestly think that's the most important thing, to get people talking about a subject that the Zionists do not under any circumstances want us to talk about. That's why they smear anybody who's involved in Palestinian active advocacy with this ludicrous lie of you're an anti-Semite. When they have no arguments, how are you going to justify the killing of children? How are you going to justify the bombing of sewage plants? Well, you say anybody who criticizes it is an anti-Semite. They have no arguments. There's nothing they can say to justify what they're doing. Self-defense goes only so far. But when you get to the level of 60,000 or 50,000 people murdered, of whom 3/4 or 2/3 are women and children and old people, it's pretty hard to justify it and defend it. So they don't defend it. They just say you're an anti-Semite. You're a terrorist supporter. And the point here is that I think that educating people is actually having an impact. The number of books that are being published on Palestine is astonishing. Books of poetry, memoirs, essays, the number of plays that are popping up all over the place. In New York City, there are like 3 or 4 plays on Palestine in the last 2 months. Knock on a Roof. I forget the other titles of the other 2, and we've seen them just in the last couple of months. This is educating people, and it's educating people in a way that a book like mine, doesn't do. You show the humanity of Palestinians in different ways, and I think that a lot of what's happening on social media, a lot of what's happening in the bypassing of the mainstream lying corporate media, is doing the same thing. People have direct access to Palestine, especially younger people, in ways that they didn't. And I think the important thing is broadening people's understanding, letting them see that all these myths that they've been told about Israel and the Palestinians are lies. And that's the long term, my way of thinking. That's the long term objective. I've always thought that, for example, the greatest value of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is not necessarily to achieve a boycott of this or sanctions of that or divestment from this by this university. If it does those things, it's great. But the main thing is it opens up a conversation that the Zionists don't want and can't win. They don't have anything to say. And their core group, their core audience is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And the people who are open to understanding about Palestine is growing larger and larger and larger. So I honestly think that every liberation movement that doesn't understand that winning over people in the metropole is as important as resistance at home. I mean, the Algerians understood this. They worked in France. The Vietnamese understood this. They worked in the United States. The Irish understood this in their War of Independence. They were working in Britain and they were working in the United States, mainly public diplomacy and propaganda. And that's how these people won. The South Africans understood this. That's what BDS, that was what the original boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement in favor of ending apartheid was about. It was about winning people over in the metropole, without which these settler colonies cannot possibly win. Colonial war is fought both, on the ground in the colony and at home in the metropole, and that's what the value of what's happening here in the United States over the last few years is, because this is the be all and the end all of the science project was always abroad. It was never in Palestine. The people who sustain it and make it possible, the money comes from here, the arms come from here, the diplomatic support comes from here, the declarations of war, if you want, as I put it in the book, come from here. And so it has to be fought here as well as there. It has to be fought intelligently. You have to win over people. You can't alienate people. You can't go into a narrow sectarian, little echo chamber of people who believe everything you believe. You have to reach out and sometimes collaborate with people you don't fully agree with. And a lot of young people don't see that, and they'll learn. I mean, I was young once upon a time during the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War, and we were narrow and sectarian a little bit, and didn't realize how much we had to win over people. It took a long time, but that movement matured, and it ultimately became a mass movement that ended the Vietnam War much too late. And I think that's the possibility here, but it's going to be hard. It'll take some time. This is not a short-term affair.
Well, thank you. I think this leaves us on a very positive note. We really appreciate you, and you've set a very high standard for our Sunday school cafe. And thank you for taking the time to be with us.
It was a pleasure. Did you also have people online, Andy?
I'm sorry?
Did you also have people online?
Yeah, a lot of people online. We're going to be posting this actually afterwards. So we do it, and then we post it on our YouTube channel.
Great.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, folks.
Here. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.
Well, so next week, like I said, we'll be on Syria, and it'll be, between 9 and 9:30. We want to have people kind of socialize a little bit, get something to drink, eat, and then we'll probably start close to 9:30.